All right, good evening, everyone. I'm Dan Murphy. I'm a volunteer and board member of the Frederick Law Olmsted Society, and I'd like to begin with a question tonight. If Riverside were just to be developed today, would it make the news? So you've heard of other communities that have made the news, naturalistic communities like Seaside, Florida, Celebration by Disney, even Prairie Crossing up in Grays Lake. So if Riverside hadn't existed before today, and the Riverside Improvement Company announced a new development, would Riverside make the news? If it were even a few years old, not nearly 150, would it be in the news the way some of those communities that I just mentioned have made the news in recent years and decades? Well, if you consider the fact that 40% of the town is public green space, that might be newsworthy. If you consider that the street design is harmonious with the banks of the river and the topography of the land, that might be newsworthy. The fact that the developers planted thousands of native trees and bushes, and that those have matured into an arboretum, that definitely might be newsworthy and kind of buck the trend of suburban development. So FLOSS members and friends friends of FLOSS, community members, we value Riverside for its historic connections, for its history. Everyone, I think, values it for its nostalgic charm. Some people call it Mayberry in reference to the 1960s idyllic hometown. So Riverside certainly has a lot of past, but what does Riverside speak to the present about? Does it have anything to say to the present or the future in terms of sustainability, quality of life, carbon sequestration, urban heat islands, and other pressing climate issues? I think the answer to all these questions is yes. If Riverside were built today, it would make the news, and it does have much to say about present and future sustainable community design. So with that, I'm going to present Charlie Pipal, Riverside resident, practicing architect, historian, award-winning professor at the Professor of Historic Preservation at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where he's taught since 1999. He holds a bachelor's degree in landscape architecture and a master's degree in architecture with a concentration in historic preservation. Both of these he earned at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He's a past board member of Landmarks Illinois, and he's currently the chair of the Riverside Preservation Commission. His professional academic focus has been on the documentation and rehabilitation of historic buildings and the interpretation of historic sites. Charlie Pipal.
Great. So it's nice to see such a big turnout here. Is there anyone actually here from Riverside? No. Oh, no. I'm going to give this talk anyway. It's a little joke. So good evening and welcome to this lecture celebrating Riverside's unique history. I'd like to thank the Riverside Public Library, especially Brent back there, who's been very helpful with this. Of course, the Olmsted Society for the opportunity to share this talk with you. As I look out into the audience, I have every reason to be terrified, as so many of you know so much about this topic. Yet here we go, encouraged by historian Connie Guardi, who's here, and my friends the Osgas, who are also here. I can blame you, Tim. In the presence of neighbors and presumably all here to be entertained and perhaps a little informed by my personal take on Riverside's history. Just to set the table, I wanted to start out with two quick notes which will help frame this rather personal tale of Riverside. The first deals with perception. As I tell my architecture and preservation students every year when I begin a class, one of the worst things I can do is to lock you in a dark room, or in this case, a well-lit room, and explain to you about beautiful spaces. So I would encourage all of you Riversiders to walk or bike or scoot or whatever you do to experience our town's uniqueness for yourself. Maybe not in a car, right? Take it at a pedestrian speed. Maybe pausing for a moment at those character-defining spaces or any place that speaks personally to you, because that's what I do. The second point deals with narration style and perspective. There's several ways to tell a compelling story about a historic place or event and attempt to breathe life and relevance into it for a contemporary audience. One way is the tried and true method, which simply lays out a story chronologically in approximate timeline fashion. This will be my approach this evening. I feel it can help you frame sequential events, and more importantly, when dealing with the built environment, shows how radical ideas and innovations in design are perceived when viewed through history's lens. So indulge me here. One exercise of the mind worth pursuing is to close your eyes, so please take a moment and just close your eyes, and envision a period vehicle parked in front of an historic building or landscape, like use this library. So what's the date of the library? I can always get a call of historians. So 1930. So imagine for yourself what a car would have looked like in 1930. Park those cars in front of this library, okay? Old cars look old. Sometimes mature landscapes and historic buildings do not, presumably because we're so accustomed to seeing them as part of our daily lives. So with that, let's begin. Here's an example using Mies van der Rohe's iconic design of 86880 Lakeshore Drive from 1949. This icon of modern style seems so incongruous with an old-fashioned car, yet the buildings belong to the same time, not our current perception of it. In Riverside, that would mean omitting the roar of the cars and replacing them with the grinding wheels of carriages on macadam streets and the clop of horses' hooves. Or picturing a person in my 1885 home in a wool suit or perhaps a large dress warming themselves by my fireplace in the wintertime. They would seem so out of place to me, but like they're reenactors or something like that. But essentially, it's their house, right? I'm really the one who's out of sync. So in that sense, it's really their space. They take ownership of it, and it's our perception of it that's kind of shifted a little bit. So with that, let's begin. I want to start with the French. And it's great that we're in this library and we see this painting in front of us. Some of you know the story of that painting. The French trader Louis Joliet and his Jesuit partner, Father Jacques Marquette. You see Father Marquette in his Jesuit smock and presumably Joliet in back of him with the rifle up in the air. They left with 5 men of French Indian ancestry, their settlement near present-day Mackinac in birch bark canoes, which I believe you even see on the bottom left, in search of the elusive passage to the Pacific. This is the photo I snapped here of the house where Joliet would later retire. It's oddly now reused as a gift shop and a boarding platform for the funicular in Quebec City, if you've ever been there. Here's a fictitious depiction, much like the image in front of you, from Herman McNeil's bas-relief panel from Chicago's Marquette Building in 1894. So traveling along the western shore of Lake Michigan, they traversed Wisconsin waterways and finally reached the Mississippi River. You kind of see it there. By mid-July, heading south, they had reached Arkansas, and realizing that from the local indigenous tribes that this was not the passage to the Pacific, but in fact the way to the Gulf of Mexico, they headed back north by another way. So in September of 1673, led by members of the Kaskaskia tribe, who actually knew where they were going, they reached the western edge of Le Portage, which was a 6-mile stretch of marshland abutting what was later known as Mud Lake, which was sometimes mud, sometimes lake. Think this is approximately in the location of today's Stickney. Here's an image from the period map published in Paris. You have to rotate the map 90 degrees to really understand what's going on in a counterclockwise direction so that north indicates is up. But what it does show is Le Portage. It's the large star indicated on the map. and other interesting features, including Charbon de Terre, which would surprise no one as being the coal deposits near Joliet, and a copper mine somewhere near modern-day Evanston, which I'm not convinced that's actually there, and a strange and perhaps less than truthful indication of mountains of marble, saltpeter, and schist along Chicago's swampy lakeshore. I had to go to my French dictionary to get what all these things were. But it was the portage that was the true find. Depending on rains, this route was fully navigable in a canoe, but sometimes required boats to be carried or portaged a short distance from the Des Plaines River to the south branch of the Chicago River. Native people, specifically the Potawatomi, knew of this portage shortcut and had used it extensively. The importance of this unique geographic feature can't be overstated, as it was later modified to become the essential link between the entire Great Lakes system and the Gulf of Mexico. Indeed, with the construction of the Illinois-Michigan Canal and later the rail network that followed its path, it was in large part responsible for the foundation of the city of Chicago and the magical transformation it had from being a marshy trading post to the global way station for goods and people traveling from east to west that we recognize today. Just 2 miles north of the western edge of the portage, the Des Plaines River carved a dramatic bend in natural landscapes. This is actually a photo I took near the Portage Monument, if you know where that is, off of Harlem. It really looks primordial, doesn't it? Here one can find large stands of elm, oak, hickory, and walnut. This is taken in Riverside. Roaming deer, cue the deer. A freshwater spring, easily accessible fords to cross the river, and natural protection on 3 sides. And, uncharacteristically, it also included variations in elevation, providing sweeping views of the river as the clear waters, believe it or not, they were clear waters, of the Des Plaines River passed by. Native peoples frequented the site and even occupied part of it. Thanks to the high, dry ground that followed the old ancient Calumet Beach site, on the shoreline of what was long gone Lake Chicago, a system of trails was developed, principally by the Potawatomi, or keepers of the fire as they were known. And it was on these trails that later European settlers would build their roads. Survivors of these trails exist today as anomalies to Chicago's unforgiving waffle grid pattern. Next time you travel in Riverside, on Long Common or Berry Point, or regionally on Plainfield Road or Ogden or Milwaukee or Elston or Green Bay Road or Archer Avenue or Vincennes, thank the Ottawa, Chippewa, and the Potawatomi who left their imprint on our landscape and provided you with a handy shortcut across Chicago's grid. And it was on this unique landscape that was later inhabited by early European settlers, including the Lawton brothers, who established a tavern near a ford in the river in the late 1820s. The large Forbes family arrived in 1833 from New York, and David Gage, the treasurer of the city of Chicago, who consolidated his land holdings into one 1,600-acre parcel in 1864 for the purpose of, and I quote, an estate and a horse and cattle breeding farm. Who knew? And it was on this unique landscape that was dramatically bisected by the then 2-track line of the Aurora Branch Railroad, later the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy in 1862. Oops, I think I'm off a little bit here. There we go. Sorry. A station named Lyons was built at the western termination of the line with a rail service yard for watering trains, because they were steam, right? And a locomotive turntable located at the present home of the Riverside Swim Club. I found that when I was looking through Sanborn maps of our area. Noticed there was a large turntable there because trains could only travel in one direction. The line was extended to Aurora in 1865, and as an aside, in 1984, under the direction of Professor Malcolm Cairns, my landscape architecture studio professor at the University of Illinois, we studied the still neglected rail corridor through Riverside. So that was one of my first times I was actually studying Riverside. During the mid-1860s, the settlers' landscape was peppered with occasional farmhouses, orchards, and taverns, and included several islands in the wilds of the river. The most prominent, Picnic Island, was located near the Bourbon Spring, so named because kegs of bourbon were poured into it to celebrate the election of Jean Beaubien as colonel of the militia of Cook County in 1834. Believe it or not, I actually saw a spring in that very area once. Has anyone seen the spring bubbling up? Am I the only person that's seen the spring? A few years ago, during wintertime, there was a short period of time when the area where Swan Pond, when it flooded over, kids would skate. So I was down there with one of my sons, and coming up out of the ground was bubbling with the approximate location. And I also actually have heard of these artesian wells giving fits to folks who are digging their basements in the First Division, so I shouldn't be surprised to see a spring. Primarily, though, the landscape remained the relatively unspoiled, sleepy pasture playground of David Gage and included his small racetrack. Do you see the racetrack here? It's in the upper right-hand corner of this image. And was frequented by Chicago's elite after their 11-mile bumpy carriage ride from the city. In 1868, Emory Childs marshaled a group of speculative real estate investors from the East Coast for the purpose of establishing a new suburban Chicago planned community. To that end, it should come as no surprise who they hired. They contacted landscape architect Frederick Olmsted and his partner here, the dashing Calvert Vaux, for the purpose of designing a community in which, and I quote, urban and rural advantages are agreeably combined. In September of 1868, Olmsted summarized his general design philosophy and approached in his preliminary report and presented it to the investors. Olmsted, already known for his award-winning design of New York Central Park, as you well know, in 1857, traveled to Chicago in December of 1868 to review the site. This is a quote, "I was ill when I reached Chicago, but to keep my engagement, drove 20 miles over open prairie, bleak and raw wind, and walked for a good deal." Sounds like he didn't like the journey. Olmsted wrote to his wife, "It must not have been a particularly pleasurable December trip for him because, as you know, the actual distance is not 20 miles, it's like 11. But accounting for roads and the fact that it was December, we have to give him a break." Olmsted proved to be no fan of 19th century urban condition and its descent into squalor. He stated unambiguously, "The mere proximity of dwellings which characterize all strictly urban neighborhoods is a prolific source of morbid conditions of the body and mind, manifesting themselves in nervous feebleness and various functional derangements. Please don't describe to your friends from Chicago as being feeble and deranged." Olmsted envisioned Riverside as a bucolic retreat where, quote, "the conveniences peculiar to the finest modern towns would be shared with the domestic advantages of a most charming country." In April 1868, Childs transferred his ownership of 1,600 acres and formally incorporated the Riverside Improvement Company, anxiously awaiting Olmsted's design work. Olmsted's true strength, in my opinion, was to quickly identify and then showcase those attributes of the site that were most fundamental to his design. Like his 19th century contemporaries, Olmsted was heavily influenced by the picturesque English school of landscape design. Like Lancelot Capability Brown, England's most famous landscape designer of the previous century, Olmsted surveyed the site conditions and provided insightful analysis which fully utilized the existing landforms, old-growth forests, and water features. He then augmented those features and drew upon them for inspiration. Though often fully created and artificial, the landscape appeared as natural, abandoning the strict formality of French courtly design of straight rows of trees, manicured hedges, and axial plans which dominate the landscape. In contrast, Olmsted's plans worked with the natural topography and existing desirable vegetation. Has anyone seen this map before? I think we have a blanket in our house that has this map on it. Is that possible? Olmsted and Vaux presented this fully rendered, now iconic, general plan of Riverside in 1869, arguably the first comprehensive design for an entire town. I know there's some debate over that, but I'm going to stick to that. The first thing one might notice is the curvilinear street pattern. This stands in direct contrast to Chicago's unyielding grid. Olmsted provided for roads which followed the natural contours of the land, specifically the slight ridge running northeast to southwest, which followed a former Indian trail, and the peculiar bend of the Des Plaines River. He used sweeping gestures as inspiration for the remainder of his suites, which opened gently to ever-changing views around each bend. A quote long attributed to the Catalan architect Antonio Gaudí is very appropriate. There are no straight lines or sharp edges in nature. Without the intersection of straight lines, streets met at odd angles, which presents an opportunity for small triangular parks. Unlike traditional development, think of Riverside as a park with buildings. Olmsted was very careful about employing large setbacks for green space and prohibited the use of front yard fencing, which would destroy the vistas through the park-like setting. An integral part of the plan was the use of commons, or land held by the village for the enjoyment of all. They were essentially three designated commons in the village: Long Common in the north, Scotswood Common to the south, and between them, the village common of Guthrie Park, where civic functions and buildings were meant to be clustered. However, the riverfront was the true star of the show. With dramatic views down the river basin, one could see Swan Pond, Picnic Island, or enjoy a stroll along the clear waters of the Des Plaines River. Other large areas were set aside as green reserves, including the low-lying Indian Gardens and the area adjacent to the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad near my house. The only true straight streets or rectangular parcels in the plan were adjacent to the straight Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. All other parcels were meant to have at least one curving or radiused edge. Let's go back. Certain critical areas of the plan were left out, and I think there's probably even people from those critical areas of the plan in this room. The large blank spot in the center, the curious large blank spot right in the center of the screen, and another section to the northeast was not included in the 1,600-acre left parcel that was owned by the Riverside Improvement Company and were not planned. So that was not part of the ownership of the village. New sewers and water service to each residence was to be included. State-of-the-art tar macadam roadways with stone curbs were planned and platted. Roadbeds were to be depressed in elevation to conceal them from the landscape and give precedence to adjacent green space. Miles of sidewalks made of Trinidad asphalt, tar, and gravel were to be installed along with gas street lights throughout. To show stability, commercial buildings for stores, a hotel, an impressive public works building, and even a church were some of the first structures built. These provided a valuable marketing tool for would-be buyers in search of a new home site or a country estate away from their city house. I was just in Pullman, and Beeman had a similar idea there where he built the Greenstone Church in the Market Square. So it's interesting. That's a little bit after Riverside. The Riverside Improvement Company's church later became the Riverside Presbyterian Church and was designed by architect John Cochran in 1879. The so-called First Division in the southwest corner of the village was developed before the other residential areas. Centered around the stately green of Scotswood Common, so named for the legendary campsite of General Winfield Scott during the Black Hawk War. This is one of my favorite moments here, where the curving Scotswood Pass splits beneath a cluster of red buds. And I think it kind of looks like that today, so. Facing the common is this Gothic Revival residence from 1869, designed by William LeBaron Jenney for Louis Schermerhorn, Olmsted's associate from New York, who worked with him on the construction of Prospect Park. This building has been meticulously maintained by the Navarro family. Neighborhood kids, including my own, refer to this as ketchup, along with its neighbor, mustard. Calvert Vaux, Olmsted's partner from England, was an architect and was responsible for the design of the Dorr Cottage in 1869, executed in the Eastlake style. The client, John Dorr, was the president of the Chicago Board of Trade, no slouch, and was the first superintendent of the Chicago public school system. Architect Mike Wimmer designed the beautiful garden pavilion to this home. The principal commercial buildings were located near the railroad tracks and originally focused on the arcade building, designed by Frederick Withers in 1871 in a Victorian Gothic style. It served as the temporary home of the Riverside Improvement Company during the early development period, along with shops and businesses. Architect William LeBaron Jenney, who I noted designed the Schermerhorn House, the mastermind behind the world's first skyscraper, designed the Riverside Water Tower in 1869 in a Swiss Gothic style. Don't look out the window because it doesn't look exactly like this now. Jenney acted as the local engineer and assisted in the layout of the utilities of the streets. His tower was struck by lightning in a twist of irony on January 1st, 1913, and burned to the ground. The current tower is a less ornate remnant of Jenney's tower. Our cherished local museum is in the adjacent pump house to the north, as there's probably people that run that museum in this room. Work in the village was slowed by the downturn in the economy due to the Great Chicago Fire in 1871. By 1877, this is kind of a striking number. There were only 45 houses built in Riverside. The company fell into financial ruin, lawsuits followed, and the village was mercifully granted a lifeline by its incorporation as a municipal entity in Illinois in 1875. Olmsted himself was partially paid in building lots and had little to do with the development after the Troubles. But gradually, over the decades, residential building sites began to fill in with houses, primarily from the center out, all adhering to Olmsted's strict setbacks. Large sections of Olmsted's plans were never executed. He originally called for a 6-mile tree-lined carriage route directly from Chicago to Riverside. Malcolm Cairns, my professor, told me that if you are on Long Common, headed northeast out of the village, as soon as you cross Harlem, it turns into something called Riverside Drive, and then it kind of continues on that angle. It was his theory that that was actually the route that tree-lined area was supposed to take. Additionally, some western portions of the plan were ceded to the Forest Preserve District of Cook County and later incorporated into the Brookfield Zoo. You kind of see here the location of the river sort of in the center of the image. Those lots or planned areas to the left where the current Brookfield Zoo is. The section of land just to the east of the river, known as Maplewood, was part of the estate of Edith Rockefeller McCormick, daughter of the founder of Standard Oil, John Rockefeller, and spouse to Harold McCormick, son of the founder of International Harvester Company, Cyrus Hall McCormick. This was planned as a separate loop. Prominent municipal buildings filled the core. They include Riverside Township Hall, designed by George Ashby in 1895 in the French Chateauesque Revival style. The Riverside train station replaced an earlier frame building and was designed in 1902 by the architects of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad and executed in the Prairie style. The station was struck by a derailed train and later reconstructed pretty much exactly as it was. The Riverside Central School, where my kids went, was designed by Charles Whittlesey in 1897 in a Romanesque revival style popularized by Boston architect and friend of Olmsted, Henry Hobson Richardson. And this building, the Riverside Public Library, designed in 1930 by O'Connor, and Martin, was designed in a Cotswold Tudor revival style. Although the architecture in Riverside was always considered secondary to the landscape, the village's uniqueness became a place where notable architects could showcase their residential work. The Matilda Bryant House, an early work by Prairie School architect George Mayer, was designed in the Queen Anne style in 1892. Are you familiar with the work of George Mayer? If you've ever been to Pleasant Home in Oak Park, his buildings have a very distinct look to them. This is not the look. So this is Mayer's early work. A year later, in 1893, Joseph Lyman Silsby, an early employer of both Frank Lloyd Wright and George Mayer, designed this residence for John Palmer, inventor of the pneumatic bicycle tire. And across the common, Frank Lloyd Wright designed the dramatic Tomek House in 1904. Its striking horizontal emphasis and jetting hip roof are carefully perched over the long common. You have a new garage, don't you? It's lovely. Louis Sullivan's Henry Babson estate, designed in 1907, was situated on a 28-acre parcel, which combined many of Olmsted's platted lots on the north end of town. The Sullivan building was unfortunately demolished in 1960. Was anyone around for that? And the land subdivided for 40 new homes. In 1914, which is 7 years after the estate was built by Sullivan, Babson reached out to architects Purcell and Elmsley, who designed service buildings to complement the Sullivan residence. The service buildings remain and are designated local landmarks. And not to be outdone by his mentor and former employee, Frank Lloyd Wright designed the expansive Coonley estate for Avery and Queen Ferry Coonley on 10 acres in the south portion of the town in 1907. The estate included a 9,000 square foot main house, several service buildings, a pool, and landscape gardens designed by Jens Jensen. Wright himself visited the project and made modifications to his original design in 1912. That's 5 years after it was constructed. So that's kind of rare that an architect can go back to their work, which is 5 years old, and start to redesign it a little bit. Threatened with demolition in 1952, the main house and service buildings were saved by the creative efforts and unyielding persuasion of artist and Art Institute professor Carolyn Howlett, who convinced the developer to partition the main house into two, retain the service buildings, and build his new ranch homes on the remaining vacant parcels. The north half of the main house and the coach house were meticulously restored by physicist and Wright enthusiast Dean Eastman and his wife, Ella May. The Coonley Playhouse was designed by Wright in 1912 as an experimental school for the Coonley children and their neighborhood friends. Oh, what money can do. Child. Students were encouraged to participate in performance art as a tool for learning and engagement. The school featured a raised stage and a band of playful, richly colored clear-story windows thematically taken from the vantage point of a child watching a parade as it passed by, complete with confetti, balloons, and American flags. The Avery Coonley School continues in its mission and is currently located in Downers Grove. The building was later converted into a single-family residence with much restoration work being performed by previous owners Ted and Susan Smith. Does anybody know Ted and Susan Smith in here? Some of the original decorative windows may be familiar, as they are included in the collections of MoMA in New York and the Art Institute of Chicago. They've been immortalized on coffee mugs, T-shirts, college dorm room posters everywhere, including my own in the late 1980s. This is this place. So it's right across from Indian Garden. Worthy of a walk. The Coonleys provided housing for their teachers at Thorncroft, a prairie residence designed by Wright associate William Drummond in 1912. The building was restored and a tasteful garage addition was added by architect Sandra Kaplan. The Riverside First Church of Christ Scientists was designed by architect Howard Cheney and executed in the prairie style and dates from 1920. The building is now a spectacular private residence. The village lots continued to be filled in from the teens through the 40s with setbacks honored as Olmsted had intended, including numerous bungalows, cottages, and period-style homes. Seen here is the noteworthy Ashinger House from 1948 by R. Harold Zook. He did a number of properties. In fact, he actually lived in Hinsdale and had his own house in Hinsdale. By the mid-20th century, there were only a few lots remaining, but there were some noteworthy additions. Perhaps the most of these was the Free Ark House by Vinci Kenny from 1975, now a local landmark. I actually worked for John Vinci for 2 years. So the plan and its significance, significant character-defining elements have held up reasonably well. When laying out his streets for horses and carriages, Olmsted could not have imagined the automobile. Tar macadam roads have given way to asphalt, and stone curbs to uniform rolled concrete ones. Unfortunately, many of the roadbeds were raised over time due to resurfacing. The Trinidad asphalt, tar, and gravel sidewalks were replaced early on due to their lack of durability in the harsh northern climate. Later replacements included proprietary concrete mixes such as granitoid and granitex. More recently, our standard is a custom village-wide river-washed exposed aggregate concrete. I'd say the common element in all these materials is that they are darker in color and downplay the visual impact of the more common white Portland concrete mix that you would see in other places. And it basically gives the visual import to the landscape as opposed to the paved surfaces. Curiously, one thing that has remained is the gas street lighting in residential areas. Despite their low light levels, the flickering flames and cast iron standards remain an important, identifying, and almost iconic feature of the village. Some here might even remember the days not long ago when on-street parking in the village required the use of parking lights. Did I see a lot of yeses? Even the newer recent improvements in the downtown hardscape in the central business district include warm LED bulbs and cast iron standards replicating the gas lights found throughout the residential portions of the village. In the 1930s, during the Works Progress Administration period, major modifications were made during the riverscape, many unsympathetic to the original design intent. As regional development led to decline in water quality of the Des Plaines River, features like the picnic island were regraded and filled. The banks of the river were lined with recycled concrete slabs laid in strata for the purpose of shore stabilization. Fortunately, some of the changes, though, were complementary, including limestone walls, paths, and these lovely steps. There's no handrail, so you have to be careful. The Swan Pond, as it's still known, is often packed with seasonal sledders, dog walkers, and wedding photographers. As a side note, my first interaction with Riverside was a violent one. You may remember there was a large tree at the base of the sledding hill. As a child of 5 or 6, I collided with that tree and sustained a session-ending head injury. Fortunately, the tree is gone, and I'm happy to report that I'm still here. The former picnic island area below has been successfully regraded as a natural flood control area, and now includes native prairie grasses, which are seasonally burned for maintenance. A durable, winding, exposed aggregate concrete path, and limestone steps to access the river for fishing and canoes are the most recent upgrades to the riverscape. It would be wonderful if the path could be extended behind the library to the swinging bridge and the power lines over the river could be removed. Let's do that, huh? So in closing, the Riverside we see today is a dynamic landscape with layers of human development. Unlike historic preservation of buildings, which are often locked into some target period of significance and then pumped full of virtual formaldehyde to keep them from decaying, historic landscapes are living, breathing, and constantly evolving complex systems. It ceases to amaze me when looking at an aerial image of the village, the sheer amount of green. Does it come through on the monitor? On a macro scale, think for a moment how much carbon dioxide is being transformed into oxygen every day. Riverside was an amazing model for sustainability and remains so a century and a half later. Looking at this image in particular, I'm reminded that Riverside is the lungs of the city. And here we find ourselves some 154 years later after its planning and 53 years after it was named a National Historic Landscape Architecture District as accidental stewards of Olmsted's vision and a place where nature carefully dances with humans. We care for this place not for nostalgia or sentimentality, but because we recognize its uniqueness and importance in nurturing us as humans. Thank you for your attention, and please go easy on corrections as I'm a professor and I have citations ready. That's fine.
Okay.
So I would imagine any question that I cannot field or make up a good answer to, there will definitely be people in this room that can answer the questions. We have some real crackerjack Olmsted Society guides in here.
So I'll ask everyone to use the microphone so this can be recorded.
Did Olmsted project the population that he expected when the village would be fully developed?
Yeah, because his plans plotted every lot, right? And in fact, it was actually probably higher than what he anticipated because as the one diagram, the iconic image, right, shows, if I can go back. Thanks for your patience. Here we go. So the entire area to the left was not platted. That's all part of the zoo. So if you think each of those would have been a house, right, it probably would have even increased the size of the population of the village.
10,000. But the arcade building wouldn't have been thought to accommodate 10,000 people, would it?
So you have to think of commerce in a different way than we think of it today, right? So that was meant for the kind of immediate needs of the people in the town, and it wasn't meant to be a place where you get like, I don't think it was meant to be a place where you get like major provisions or big purchases. So you wouldn't buy like a settee or a table there or something like that.
But groceries. Thank you.
And people had fewer things, right? Like, you know, people get very frustrated when they think about their Victorian house and how it doesn't have closets. That's because people didn't have clothes. Clothes were expensive.
Olmsted had himself a road across the prairie to get to Riverside, but there was a railroad here at the time. So why didn't he take the railroad?
Why did the chicken cross the road? That's a great question. Yeah, he
I
wrote to his wife
I
about.
already have an answer.
I don't have an answer. I just know he wrote to his wife.
He was thinking ahead to the parkway.
Oh, okay.
That he wanted to design, as a connection between Riverside and Chicago, okay?
That
And
sounds
that
good.
parkway ran through Riverside, Riverside Drive, Cermak Road, to Ogden Avenue, to Western Avenue, which was the western end of Chicago at the time. And if you see the wideness of Cermak Road in Berwyn and Cicero, he wanted to divide the parkway into 4 different roads, okay? One for horse and carriage, one for horseback, one for walking, and one for service roads. So it was quite complicated. We've actually found a schematic of it that the Olmsted company put out in one of the early newspapers. Very interesting stuff.
Thanks for sharing that.
And I think he came here in August. Check your citation on that. August of '68.
Any other comments or questions from anyone?
No questions. Take a walk tonight. Thank you. How do we do on time?
I think you're fine.
Okay, yeah.
So, sorry, a few announcements before I let you all go. The Olmsted Society will be sponsoring a landscape workday this Saturday at 9 to noon at the Long Common and Downing Triangle. We have the Olmsted Overlook Olmsted Overlook. It's a tongue twister. Olmsted Overlook ribbon cutting this Saturday also at 1 p.m. On Fairbank Road above the river. The poetry contest deadline is this Sunday, April 30th. So if you know a child in a Riverside school and they want to submit a poem to our contest, the deadline is Sunday. Vintage baseball is back at the big ballpark on Saturday, May 20th. And our first walking tour of the year begins May 28th, Sunday, May 28th at the Riverside train station. You can get tickets at the Olmsted Society website. So more speakers will be coming in the fall as soon as I arrange them. Thanks to the Riverside Library, especially Brent, for all his help. Thanks to Riverside TV for recording our presentations. And a special thanks to Charlie for an excellent presentation. Thank you all for coming, and good night.